The way that players get discussed amongst the entirety of the NBA community creates narratives surrounding them that become very tough to break without significant change. The average fan tends to have a certain idea of what a player is like, but how that player actually produces on a nightly basis may not always match up to said perception. This brings us to the topic of both this video and my next video, where we will be discussing the players who tend to get the most underrated and overrated by the public. With this season approaching its close, it seemed like the perfect time for this discussion as the playoffs loom. We'll be starting with the most underrated players in this video, and what I mean by that is I believe that the public perception of these players is either way more negative than it should be, or they just simply don't get the recognition that they deserve. Before we start though, it turns out about 64% of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so please, if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I would also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. The first player we'll be discussing that falls into this category of being underrated in the NBA today is Russell Westbrook of the Washington Wizards. Russ is a very polarizing player in the NBA, and he's been basically written off after the way his season ended last year, and then also because of how it began this year. I actually made a video discussing this topic not too long ago, and recently Russ himself has even acknowledged it in interviews, but in that time period, he was very much not at 100% strength and was playing through hamstring injuries that were holding him back on the court. Over the last few months, since the All-Star break, we've seen Russ back at full strength once again, and in that time, he's been playing unbelievable basketball to help the Wizards get back into the playoff race with averages of 23 points, 13 rebounds, and about 13 assists per game in that span. He was written off completely as a star. People assumed his game was going to start to fade quickly, and yet he's still the triple-double machine who puts constant pressure on the defense, creates tons of good looks for his teammates, and elevates the play of the team around him. The next underrated player we'll be discussing is Bam Adebayo of the Miami Heat. Bam broke out onto the scene last season, making his first All-Star team and proving to be an unbelievable two-way presence for a team that made a run to the finals. This year, however, his play has flown completely under the radar, and the crazy thing is, he's gotten so much better. Sure, the Heat have had a relatively disappointing season as a whole, currently only being in 6th place in the Eastern Conference, but while a lot of the players around him have struggled with inconsistencies, Bam has been the one true constant source of positive play. When you talk about elite defenders who can guard 1 through 5, Ben Simmons is usually the player most often brought up, but Bam Adebayo absolutely joins him on that list. Bam is not only a phenomenal interior defender, but he also confidently switches out onto smaller, quicker elite guards and engulfs them. Throw in his averages of about 19 points, 9 rebounds, and 5 assists per game, and should not only be a lock for first team all-defense, but will also find his name possibly on all-NBA lists in the very near future. The next underrated player we'll be discussing is Andrew Wiggins of the Golden State Warriors. Wiggins is another player that has had quite a polarizing career to this point, and if you looked back at the overrated and underrated lists in many of the years past, he would probably have fallen on quite a few of the overrated lists. However, the constant negativity surrounding the coverage of his career has now brought him to the exact opposite end of the spectrum, where all of the good that he brings to the table tends to get completely glossed over, hence why he's now on this list. Wiggins used to get ragged on all the time for his inefficiency scoring the ball and his complete lack of effort on defense. This season with the Warriors, he's improved a ton shooting the ball, and most importantly is he's actually become a quality defender that holds his own against the opposing team's top players night in and night out. He may not have lived up to the star potential that people thought he had when he was drafted, but he's definitely a valuable part of the Warriors' rotation. The next underrated player we'll be discussing is Collin Sexton of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Sexton has taken huge strides forward as a scorer and overall player in each of his 3 seasons in the NBA so far, and it really is a shame that the state of the Cavaliers overshadows that. Sexton's putting up about 24 points per game this season, shooting the ball efficiently from all 3 levels, he plays in constant attack mode, and he provides a ton of entertainment out on the floor. It's easy to overlook his production and call it empty because of the state of the team around him and the fact that they're not winning much, but the efficiency with which he gets his buckets tells me that he would be a phenomenal option on any team trying to win. Up next in this underrated discussion, we have Paul George of the Los Angeles Clippers. Paul George finds himself on this list for pretty obvious reasons, as he's been the butt of jokes from fans for the better part of the last year. Some things he says rub people the wrong way, he can at times make himself an easy target, but most importantly of all, his collapse in last year's postseason has resulted in nobody really being willing to give him any credit for what he does well because of how bad that was. This season, George has been playing some fantastic basketball, shooting the lights out and scoring a nice 24 points per game efficiently, as he's helped the Clippers get to 3rd place in the Western Conference standings right now, and the Clippers are starting to get hot at the perfect time. But George will remain underrated by the majority of fans until he proves himself in the playoffs to make up for it. The next underrated player we'll be discussing is Ben Simmons of the Philadelphia 76ers. Ben's been a polarizing player for pretty much his entire career because of the fact that he doesn't shoot jumpers despite playing the point guard position, but his impact on the team goes far beyond scoring. First off, he's one of the main frontrunners for the Defensive Player of the Year award this season, because he's truly one of the few people in the NBA who can confidently guard any position and lock them up. Then offensively, his presence in terms of creation for those around him, setting up shooters for open looks by penetrating the paint and drawing in the defense, and even his transition play is all top-notch, and it was most evident when the Sixers lost 4 games in a row when he was out injured. He's an elite two-way player, but he doesn't often get treated as such. Next up in the underrated discussion, we have De'Aaron Fox of the Sacramento Kings. Fox is yet another example of a player who has been sensational this year and has steadily improved in each year of his career so far, but he's just stuck on a team that continues to be poorly run and lacking insufficient help. His speed in the open floor and even in half-court settings allows him to blow by defenders with ease and create quality chances for both himself and those around him. He scores an efficient 25 points per game, and he dishes out a nice 7 assists in the process as well. Fox is still young, but he is in his 4th season, and the Kings struggling to put together a quality team around him is what's holding him back. The next underrated player we'll be discussing is DeMar DeRozan of the San Antonio Spurs. DeRozan seemingly got forgotten about ever since his arrival in San Antonio, and this especially became the case when the Spurs' playoff streak ended last year. But he himself is arguably playing better than ever, and he really rounded out his game to be able to be a balanced contributor this year. He's averaging a career-high 7 assists per game, and has embraced more of an initiator role offensively rather than just being a scorer. The Spurs are still alive for the play-in game, and they definitely wouldn't be there without DeRozan leading the way for them. And finally, the last underrated player we'll be discussing today is Clint Capela of the Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks were in desperate need of some defensive stability before this season began, and even though they still aren't exactly great on that end of the floor, Capela has come in and helped a ton in that regard. He's leading the league in rebounding, he's blocking over 2 shots per game, he and Trae Young have formed a very formidable 2-man game in the pick and roll, and while Trae Young tends to get a lot of the credit for the Hawks' emergence into a playoff team, Capela definitely deserves his fair share of props as well. He's a very solid anchor in the middle that protects the rim and plays his role at a high level offensively, and it's the kind of production in the less glorified parts of the game that he's helped a ton with. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below any more players that you think are underrated in the league today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.